Welcome to this explainer. Today we're untangling a mystery of the human mind that has literally been puzzling people for 200 years. We're looking at the striking, undeniable resemblance between a psychedelic trip and a dream. If you've ever wondered why altering your brain chemistry feels so incredibly similar to falling asleep while you're still completely conscious, well, you're in the exact right place. Okay, let's dive into this.
You know, if you ask anyone who has taken a strong dose of a classical psychedelic to describe what happened, you're almost always going to hear some variation of this exact quote. It's wild, this specific phrase has been popping up in trip reports for nearly 2 centuries. People talk about rooms that breathe, fluid, impossible logic that somehow feels completely reasonable in the moment, and just a total flood of inner imagery. It all carries the unmistakable grammar of a dream.
But that brings us to a really fascinating question. Is this universal intuition just a poetic metaphor? Or is it a measurable biological reality happening inside your brain? Well, as it turns out, modern neuroscience has spent the last couple of decades turning that very question into hard data.
Let's look at the timeline here, because this isn't just some idea left over from the 1960s counterculture. Way back in 1845, a French psychiatrist named Moreau de Tours hypothesized that the drug state and the dream state were identically the same phenomenon. He actually believed a sane person could take a substance to study madness from the inside. Fast forward to the year 2000, and Alan Hobson created a map of consciousness that placed the psychedelic state on the exact same axes as REM sleep. And by 2016 and 2017, modern neuroscientists were successfully mapping this connection down to the exact brain receptors.
And the modern data backs this up in a truly staggering way. In 2016, researchers ran a massive semantic data analysis on over 15,000 written drug reports. They compared the specific language used in these reports against a massive database of dream reports. The result? Classic psychedelics, we're talking LSD and psilocybin, ranked closer to dream reports than literally any other class of substance on Earth.
So what do these two states actually share? Let's check out the shared fingerprints. Both the psychedelic state and REM sleep are what we call primary states of consciousness. They both run on entropic brain, which basically just means brain activity becomes much more flexible and, well, chaotic. In both of these states, your default mode network, the network that usually strictly controls your rigid sense of self, is heavily loosened, and that decoupling leads directly to those dissolved personal boundaries and the highly fluid, emotionally charged imagery we all associate with dreams.
In 2017, a study by Kraehenmann and his colleagues put this to the test in such a cool way. First, they gave subjects LSD to generate that bizarre, illogical, dreamlike mental imagery. Then, they introduced a drug called ketanserin, which specifically blocks the serotonin 2A receptor, or the 5-HT2A receptor. The result? The dreamlike state completely vanished. And this brilliantly illustrates how the dreaminess of a trip relies entirely on activating that one specific serotonin receptor.
But why in the world does tweaking just one receptor create an entire dream state? The answer to that lies deep in the middle of your brain, at a structure called the thalamus. According to leading neurological models, the thalamus acts as a sensory filter. It's essentially a gatekeeper that decides what sensory information floods into your conscious awareness and what stays out. Both dreaming and tripping fundamentally alter how this critical filter operates.
When psychedelics enter your system, they weaken the inhibition that normally keeps that gate half closed. So the gate basically swings wide open. Suddenly, a massive sensory overload and all your inner thoughts pour through to the cortex at the exact same time. And brain imaging confirms this. Under LSD, the normal flow of restricted information into the thalamus drops, which is exactly what an opening gate would predict. Dreaming is the exact same radically altered thalamic gating, it's just triggered by a different key.
So the logic here seems pretty flawless, right? The phenomenology matches, the brain networks match, the thalamic gate matches. All of this leads us to a pretty obvious question. If a trip is basically a dream, does taking these substances actually cause you to slip into deeper REM sleep?
Well, here is the massive plot twist in the data. Look at this comparison between daytime use of ayahuasca and psilocybin versus a placebo. If a trip were literally just REM sleep, psychedelics should lengthen and deepen your dreaming. But controlled studies show they do the exact opposite. Daytime use of these substances actually severely lengthens your REM latency, meaning it takes you way longer to reach REM sleep, and it severely suppresses the overall duration of real dreaming.
To figure out why a trip feels like a dream but actually pushes sleep away, we have to look at a huge neurochemical contradiction. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how opposite these states are under the hood. Normal REM sleep is a cholinergic state, meaning it's driven by acetylcholine while your brain's serotonin system goes completely quiet. But the psychedelic state, it does the exact opposite. It floods your brain with active serotonin signaling. So a trip arrives at a dreamlike state through an entirely opposite pharmacological road.
Because of this fundamental difference in serotonin, a trip isn't just you being asleep. The data shows that the closest statistical match isn't actually standard REM sleep at all, but specifically the lucid dream. It is the dreaming brain, with all its fluid imagery and dissolved boundaries, joined by a waking witness.
And I can't emphasize enough how much this distinction matters in the real world. Think about the profound power of this state. A trip is essentially a dream that you can remember, and far more importantly, a dream you can actively steer. You maintain your presence, your recall, and your agency during a deeply altered state of mind.
That agency creates an incredible therapeutic window. You see, ordinary REM sleep does the heavy lifting of filing away our daily emotional residue and consolidating our memories. But psychedelics open up a very similar, highly plastic window while we are wide awake. They trigger BDNF, which is a protein that acts kind of like Miracle-Gro for your brain, building new synapses and allowing the brain to update emotional memories, completely reorganizing how we process our past. This is the absolute essence of healing trauma with the lights on. For example, MDMA-assisted therapy uses this exact waking dream state to help individuals recall deeply traumatic memories. Because the patient is fully conscious but in a highly plastic, dreamlike state with a deep, felt sense of safety, they can effectively refile that traumatic memory with far less fear. You are actively participating in the emotional filing system that your brain usually only runs in the dark.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking. We really can't talk about psychedelics and dreaming without addressing a very seductive and wildly popular myth. I'm sure you've heard it before. The idea that a trickle of natural endogenous DMT from your brain's pineal gland is what actually causes our nightly dreams. So is DMT really the brain's ultimate dream molecule?
Look, it's a beautiful, romantic story, but scientifically, it is simply an unproven hypothesis. So the crucial point is that while DMT is genuinely present in mammalian tissue, which is amazing, careful scientific reviews, like the 2018 Barker Review, show there is zero solid evidence that natural DMT ever rises during dreaming or that it reaches the psychoactive levels required to actually cause a dream. We really have to treat it as an evocative idea, not an established scientific fact.
So where does this leave us? Honestly, the true science of the waking dream is far more fascinating than any magic molecule anyway. The overlap between tripping and dreaming is incredibly real at the level of human experience and brain network dynamics. The thalamic gate opens, the ego dissolves, and the imagery flows. It is the dream logic of REM running in a mind that is still home, still watching, and still able to remember.
Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative question to think about today. Every single one of us carries emotional baggage that our brains try to quietly process every night while we sleep. But if you could safely steer the emotional processing of your own dreams while wide awake, fully conscious, and in control, what would you heal? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible potential of the human mind.